Good afternoon. It's both a pleasure and an honour to address EATS 2016. Thank you very much to Halldale for giving me the opportunity. I addressed this audience back in 2014 in a presentation all about language assessment for student selection. And my presentation today builds on that, but with a focus on training. At Latitude, we've spent the last 4 years looking really closely at language for selection and training. And today I'm going to share with you a little of what we've learnt along the way. Firstly, please raise your hand if you are an instructor or have been an instructor. Okay. And please raise your hand if the organisation you work for provides some or all of its training in the medium of English. And please raise your hand if you are a student or if you yourself undergo your professional training in the medium of English. Okay. So the title of this presentation this afternoon is English Language Proficiency for Successful Aviation Training, which to a greater or lesser extent is a subject which is relevant to everybody in this room. In fact, to everybody in today's aviation industry. As aviation continues to drive globalization and grows at an astonishing rate, the vast majority of the world's future aviation professionals will not have English as a first language, and yet so much of the world's aviation training is conducted in the medium of English. So our challenge then is to make this training accessible so that we train efficiently, so that our students learn successfully, so we can fly safely. This presentation is not about the ICAO language proficiency requirements. It's not about ATC communications or about emergency situations or about ICAO level 4. It's about the language that students need to learn and the language that we use when we provide training to students who don't have English as a first language. And my focus is going to be on ab initio aviation training, but I believe the points I raise will be equally relevant to professional pilots, to cabin crew, to maintenance engineers, to air traffic controllers, and to anybody involved with teaching or learning aviation subject matter. And this will be an interactive presentation, and you'll need to talk to the person sitting next to you. So make sure that you're sitting next to somebody you like or like the look of. And there are 3 things I would like you to take away from this presentation. The first is that language for aviation training is not general English, obviously, but it's also crucially not a list of aviation-related vocabulary. It's much more than that. In fact, language for successful training has got very little to do with aviation, believe it or not. It's rather the broad technical language that we see in science, in technology, in engineering, and in maths, all in the context of aviation. And for the purposes of this presentation, let's call this language foundation language. My second takeaway for you is that whether you are a cadet on day 1 of a PPL or whether you are a captain doing an OPC, all aviation trainees need really good proficiency in foundation language. This means developing and selecting courses which address this need. And finally, for training to be successful, aviation instructors and instructional designers need to pay close attention to the language they use when communicating with students who don't have English as a first language, and they need to make their language readily accessible. Let's begin with our first activity, and in front of you, you should see a worksheet which looks something like this. If you don't have one, your partner will, which means you'll have to share. Here is your first task on English for specific purposes. You have 1 minute to read the text and answer the question. Read the text. Is it A, B, C, or D? 1 minute. Go. Okay, check your ideas with your partner. And the answer? C. Absolutely. Well done. Raise your hand if you know what CRIDDLE'S reaction is or you know what phenyl dioxide is. So you don't know anything about the subject matter, and yet you answer the question correctly, which means that you have good foundation language. Let's have a look at this in detail. It can't be A, because the text says, allow a steady flow. It can't be B, because the text says between 23 and 25,000 CPS. It can't be D, because there's no mention in the text at all about the Graysons rising. This is a tough question, actually, because you have to read the whole text to rule out the answer. So it has to be C. Now, you're all like the perfect ab initio cadets on day 1 of aviation training. You don't know anything about the subject, but you've got good foundation language. For your information, CRIDDLE is complete nonsense. There is no such thing as a Grayson or phenyl dioxide. I invented it to illustrate a point. And that point is that good foundation language will lead to successful training. It's essential for students to know words like distance, steady, cycle, pumped, warms, release, in order to learn effectively. So, you may think, what's the relevance of CRIDDLE'S reaction? So let's put the aviation back into English. And here's the noun, pressure, with its verb, pressurize, and its noun, pressurization. Here's a neat little word, which is absolutely nothing to do with aviation per se. It can be used in many contexts. Here you can see it in relation to the CRIDDLE'S reaction. But it can be used in other technical and non-technical contexts. For example, it can be used in the context of sport. It can be used in the context of business and economics. And it can be used in the context of legal and regulatory documentation. This from the United Kingdom Health and Safety Executive. And yet pressure appears everywhere in aviation training. It appears in principles of flight, meteorology, airframes, power plant, instrumentation, and in human performance. So we can see that knowledge of the noun pressure and the concept that pressure represents is central to understanding aviation training. Now, taking our typical candidate for pilot training. They are, in the main, young, bright, intelligent, well-educated, and they've got a good background education in maths and physics. We can be confident that the student will know the word pressure and the concept that it represents in their own language. Our challenge, then, is to make sure they know this word in English in order to unlock meaning across the range of aviation subject matter. And here's our next activity, and we're going to stay with reading skills. And once again, looking on your worksheet, it's the second text here. This is an extract from an ATPL manual on airframes and systems. I would like you to underline the words you think are exclusively aviation English. That is, they are only used in the aviation field. Work with your partner, underline the words. 1 minute, go. Okay, time's up. And you've probably seen that there are a few words that we could possibly call aviation English, and exclusively aviation English. Fixed landing gear, that has a specific meaning in aviation. But are the words fixed, landing, and gear, are they exclusive to aviation? Then we have the word undercarriage, again, a very specific meaning in aviation. But this word is also used in the automotive industry. It's used to describe caravans, trucks, and automobiles. So it's not an exclusive word to aviation. And then what about the rest of the words? Rubber cord, used, shock absorber, usually form tubular struts. Are these aviation English? Well, yes, of course they are, because they're in a manual about airframes and systems. But these words do not belong to aviation. These are the broad, technical vocabulary items that we can call foundation language. This is what students need to know in order to be successful in aviation training. Now, we've spent a long time looking at words and their meaning. Let's look a little more deeply at this text, and we will see some more complex things happening. We can see here that there is a relationship between the material used in shock absorbers and the design of the landing gear, and this is what you can expect and what usually happens. And this sentence describes how something is constructed. These two very important words, they give a reason for why something is done in a particular way or for a particular design. This structure is called the zero conditional. And this is how we make the zero conditional. And it appears everywhere in aviation training. When rubber cord is used, the undercarriage is usually, if you apply full flap, drag increases. This is very common aviation language and can be difficult for students to understand. In this text, we had 3 examples of the passive. Here's how we make the passive. You didn't expect a grammar lesson this afternoon, did you? Anyway, here's how we make the passive. And again, it's very common in technical texts and can be very difficult for students who do not have an equivalent of this structure in their first language. Here is a reduced relative clause. And we can see here that the writer has dropped the relative pronoun that and the auxiliary verb to be. And this is very common in formal technical text. But just because it's common doesn't make it easy to understand. So let me wrap up this point then and say once again that to read and understand aviation training manuals, students don't need a list of aviation-related vocabulary. What they need is broad foundation language. That is, the grammar and the vocabulary which commonly occurs in technical texts in aviation, and that much of this grammar and vocabulary is not exclusive to aviation at all. And this brings me to the final part of my presentation, and here we're going to look at listening skills and classroom language. And I have a short extract of a British theoretical knowledge instructor talking to a group of international students about the Coriolis effect. And this is your third and final task. I would like you to listen to the instructor and decide how clear you think the instructor is. You have a transcript of what the instructor says on your worksheet, and you have a scale here where 1 is not clear at all and 5 is perfectly clear. So again, listen and decide how clear you think the instructor is.
Morning.
Hi.
Good morning.
Morning.
Okay. Let's see, where do we go from here? Probably best. Let's start by going over what we were talking about last week. Does anybody remember what we talked about last Friday? Ladies and gentlemen? Is there anybody out there? A clue then. Something caused by the spinning of the Earth. Anyone? You may recall the Coriolis effect?
Uh-huh.
Right. This is the force equal to... Okay. This is a force equal to 2 times omega rho v sine theta. Remember?
No.
Okay. Let's start from scratch with a picture on the board. Here is the Earth,
Okay.
and this is the North Pole.
Oh,
And
right.
this is the South Pole.
Okay.
Viewed from above, the North Pole is rotating counterclockwise in a direction opposite to a clock, like this.
Oh.
If you were standing on the equator with the sun directly above you, it would be... What time would it be?
Midday.
Excellent.
Okay.
Now, you stay standing there on the rotating Earth. How long would it be?
Okay, with your partner, decide how clear was the instructor. 30 seconds, go. Any thoughts? Any numbers? 2? 5. 5. Okay, we've got a range there. Interesting. Let's analyze this together then. So he does some things well and some things not so well. At the beginning, he's quite hesitant. He produces what we call false starts, which are very common to spoken language, and they can be very difficult for students to follow. He takes a long time to begin, but when he does begin, he uses 2 very clear signposts. And these signposts are really important to the student for them to engage with the instructor and prepare for what the instructor is going to say. Then we have this rather strange comment. And there are layers of meaning here. The most literal layer of meaning is there anybody in this classroom? Now, what students are going to say yes or no to that? Another layer of meaning would be, can anyone answer my question? Again, it's a rhetorical question, So a student is very unlikely to answer it. But here's the real meaning. The instructor's making a comment about what he thinks about the students, and he's using the metaphor of being alone in deep space. And what he's really saying is, what's the matter with you today? Are you on the right planet? This language with the humor embedded within it is going to be lost on almost every international student because it requires not only knowledge of language, but it requires knowledge of culture, which many international students are very unlikely to have. Then he uses a variety of question types. The first is quite complex, and it's more of an invitation for the students to show that they know what the instructor is talking about. And the answer would be, yes, I know, or no, I don't. Much better, just ask a simple, direct question. And also to grade and simplify the language. Students are much more likely to know the verb remember than they are the verb recall. With the second question, well, this isn't a question at all. Grammatically, it's not a question. And in any case, it's very unlikely to get a response because the instructor is actually asking the student to complete his sentence. Culturally, many international students will be very unwilling to do this in a classroom setting. Much clearer, again, just to ask a direct question. Here we have another signpost, which is excellent, but this bit isn't. This sort of idiomatic language from scratch is going to be lost on so many students unless they have English as a first language. And this is the sort of thing that native-speaking instructors do much more than non-native-speaking instructors, which means that British, American, South African, Australian instructors need to pay special attention to the language that they use with international students. Then the instructor says this, and this is great because firstly he presents the concept, then he paraphrases the concept, and then he uses a gesture at the end, which is excellent technique to really reinforce the concept and to help the students understand what he's talking about. In terms of the language the instructor uses, we've got some very basic foundation language verbs like cause, spin, rotate, stand, stay, view. We've got some abstract nouns, force, direction, effect, time. We've got some nouns specific to geography, the equator, the sun, North Pole, the earth. We've got adverbs, prepositions, and adjectives directly above, equal, opposite. We've got some language specific to mathematics, 2 times, for example. And then we've got a lot of classroom language. Let's start by going over, does anyone remember? And then we've got some more complex grammatical forms. Here is a passive, which, as we saw before, is very common in aviation teaching, but active structures are generally much easier for international students to understand. Then we have the second conditional, and this is how we make the second conditional. We use the second conditional to set up a hypothetical scenario, and this is very common, very natural classroom language. It's also quite complicated grammatically, and it has quite a complex meaning, so students may struggle with this. Looking back over the listening then, on the instructor's side, there are factors which influence successful communication. And these will be delivery, such as false starts, hesitations, repetitions. How much the instructor grades or simplifies his or her language, and how direct and explicit the instructor is. How the instructor organizes speech using signposts, but also using his or her voice and pausing to show the start, the middle, and the end of what he or she is saying. The use of paraphrase and gesture to support the presentation of new concepts, how quickly the instructor speaks, and ideally we are looking for a nice, slow, clear delivery. And finally, and very importantly, the language choices that the instructor makes. Is the instructor using clear, unambiguous foundation language, and is he or she avoiding idiomatic language? On the student side, first and foremost, the question is the student proficient in foundation language? Does the student know verbs such as cause, form, and pressurize? Assuming that the student is proficient in foundation language, here are the other challenges. Firstly, familiarity with the subject matter. Aviation is pretty technical and complex. If the student is more familiar with it, learning is likely to be quicker and more effective. Then we have familiarity with instructor style, the instructor's accent, and the instructor's culture. Obviously, for students, as training progresses, things get easier. Many students report that the first few weeks of aviation training in their second language is really, really difficult. But it does get easier as time goes on. And at the end of training, students who have been immersed in an English-speaking environment have very high communicative competence. So to wrap up this talk then, I'm going to return to some of my earlier slides and to those three things that I really want you to take away from this presentation. Firstly, it's not general English, obviously, but crucially, it's not a list of aviation-specific vocabulary. The language that students need is the broad foundation language, the language of science, technology, engineering, and maths in the context of aviation. Secondly, all aviation trainees, whether it's day one of PPL or a captain's OPC, need good proficiency in foundation language in order to learn subject matter effectively. If students don't have English as a first language, then training in foundation language will be very helpful. And then finally, for training to be successful, aviation instructors and instructional designers need to be aware of the language they use and to choose their language carefully in order to make their training readily accessible to those trainees that don't have English as a first language. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.